What's up, Anthony? So good to see you. How's it going, man?
I'm great. It's great to be here with you, Chris. How's it
Awesome.
going?
So, where are you at right now? Tell us a little bit about kind of just where you're doing this interview from.
Yeah, I'm calling in from an office that I'm borrowing here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill while mine gets ready. I'm brand new to town. Well, not really new, but coming back. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm Chris Courtheyn. I'm here in Boise, Idaho. What we wanted to do today, Anthony and I are longtime friends, and just talk a little bit about our histories and the work we've done as researchers, as activists, and also, in my case, its connection to my musical project. So, Anthony, what do you remember about like the first time that we met? Do you want to just share your recollections of that, and then I'll kind of share
I,
my side?
I have been jogging my memory and trying to look back through email archives to figure out when it is that we met. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was here at UNC, and it must have been like 2012, 2013. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we actually met in a graduate seminar that I sat in on for Arturo Escobar's class. And we ended up just kind of hitting it off based on our mutual interest. Yeah, I remember we spent a long afternoon talking together over at your place because I was just getting back from spending a while in Urabá in northwestern Colombia and had visited the peace community a couple of times. And yeah, I was really excited to hear about your work and learn about what you had been up to. And it seemed like we had a lot in common. I don't know. What do you remember?
Well, I remember I have some images that come to mind. I remember us walking through, I think it was the Global Education Center, the Center for Global Initiatives. There was like that building. It was kind of on the edge of campus. And I lived close by there as well. So I don't know if we were there and then went over, you said, coming over to the house that I was living in. But I have a very vivid memory of us kind of walking through there and talking. And we obviously, Arturo Escobar, the Colombian anthropologist, who's published really important critiques of the development project, and his research about resistance communities and especially Black communities in the Colombian Pacific. So he was one of my professors, mentored me and was on my dissertation committee, and then mentored you, right, as an undergraduate, right? So kind of converged there, you having known him from before, from your undergrad there, and then I, being a grad student there. And I also remember, I can't remember if it was the first trip. You made multiple trips to Chapel Hill back then, and so we would always connect when you were there. But my most vivid memory, apart from just you and I talking about things, was when you came to campus and you came with the Washington Office on Latin America, and you brought Francia Marquez, one of the really important activists from the Cauca region of Colombia and the Black communities movement there for the defense of territory and life worlds and all of that. And you were there that did an event at the Sonia Hayes Center, I believe. And so you brought her, and then we interacted with Francia and you throughout kind of those days. So I can't remember if that was actually the first time we met, but I know you came in and were part of kind of the activist side of these conversations about territory, resistance, social movements, race, these concepts. And you at the time were an activist and were critical in bringing in someone like Francia Marquez, who's now gone on to be the vice president of the country. But so I have a very vivid memory of that event and you kind of speaking along with Francia, and me having worked as an accompanier with these kind of US-based solidarity organizations. There was kind of that natural connect there. So do you remember anything about that event or kind
Yeah,
of those encounters
I
we had?
that I guess places it a little earlier than I remember. Because then, if that must be the case, it must have been in 2011 or so, when I was working at WOLA, and and yeah, no, I definitely remember that event, and I think just another kind of interesting thing to reflect on there is, while a lot of this is happening at an academic institution, it's actually what people are involved in outside of the academy that's making these things possible. And so somebody like Arturo was my professor, but we were actually much more involved in, and I got to know him much better through the Afro-Colombian Solidarity Network, which was a collective that I was a part of, and the GAIDEPAC, the Grupo de Académicos e Intelectuales en Defensa del Pacífico, which is another kind of formation that we were all a part of. and trying to build awareness and get folks to take collective action on questions to, stand up for the rights of Black folks that were being displaced by their land, from their lands, or threatened otherwise by many actors in the region. So yeah, yeah. No, I definitely remember that. That was a very special trip down to UNC. And we actually ended up also going to an industrial hog farm with Francia and Clemencia Carabalí here in North Carolina to think about, environmental racism and how folks in the Carolinas are also standing up to the injustices that they're facing. And so building solidarity has, I think, been like a key kind of aspect of how you and I have met and the kinds of spaces that we've gotten to know each other over the years, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to say more? Because you were an undergrad at UNC, you studied certain things there, and then just a little bit of how kind of your life before that trip and how you got involved when WOLA and kind of how UNC was part of that history from earlier on.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have incredible mentors here at UNC when I was an undergraduate that pushed me to experience the world and to learn as much as I could. And so, as part of that, I ended up studying abroad in Cuba in 2006, and I was very involved in, student activism here on campus through what was then called the Carolina Hispanic Association. And I was just really interested in learning about, where my mother came from. I'm from North Carolina, but my mom is Colombian, and that was always a big question for me, and how I could think about like the place that she was from. And here at UNC, I had the opportunity to, after returning from Cuba, to write my undergraduate thesis on the ELN, the Colombia's second largest guerrilla group. And from there, it just kind of took off because I really got in touch with a lot of human rights organizations in Colombia that opened the door to working in Washington and going back to Colombia as a Fulbright scholar right after my undergrad to deepen those connections with folks that I was working with in Colombia. And it just kind of set me on track to really be able to pursue not just these intellectual interests, but also political commitments that I had for struggling for social justice. And that's remained central to who I am as a person over the years. And it's also, I'd say been an immense privilege and fortune for me because I get to meet people like you, Chris, and uh, to continue over the course of decades, to build out these conversations and continue working together on things that, can be quite painful in many moments, but are ultimately, I think, what gives life meaning.
Yeah. I mean, it's really similar. I mean, it's interesting to think about kind of the similarities, but also the differences, right? So, how I came to joining the solidarity movement, broadly speaking, and in particular, Fellowship of Reconciliation's accompaniment program and the Peace Community San José de Apartadó is partly due to that my undergraduate experience was also really central to that. I was a Latin American studies major at UC Berkeley and studied Spanish at the community college in my hometown. And just in the course of learning about Latin American history is the profound role of the US, right? And it's propping up dictators, it's overthrowing leftist governments in the region. And as a US citizen, thinking, wait a minute, this isn't right. And what's my responsibility in this? Without any direct, family connection or anything otherwise to the region. But my mom having been a flight attendant, I had traveled in the region a little bit. I'd gone to Venezuela when I was in college. This was right. Hugo Chavez had just been elected and was just about to come into power. So it was right before the Bolivarian government came in. I'd been to Chile. So I'd been to a few of the countries, which was really, I loved Spanish and Portuguese and wanted to learn those languages. And also just for me, rooted in my Catholic upbringing and these values of solidarity and service to the poor and a lot of those values that I was instilled with. And then my dad was in the Vietnam War as well in the Navy and came out very critical of the U.S. foreign policy. So as I traveled around the world, I gained, I was open to critiques of the U.S. because of some of the ways that I had been brought up, and then also felt like I had to do something about it. But even as I was an undergrad, I wasn't super politically active. I did some things as an undergrad, but I always felt like the activists, the human rights movement, these resistance communities, that was for people like the real people. Like I wasn't necessarily good enough to do that kind of work. And I was linked in my hometown to the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz, which was a center to do trainings, and there would be events, and a Fellowship of Reconciliation event came through. I graduated from my undergrad and was thinking about what I would do forward. And FOR came through, and there was someone who'd done the accompaniment project in Colombia. They're promoting that, looking for volunteers to join that team. And I thought, this is exactly what I'm looking for. This isn't kind of the top-down development of I go somewhere to tell them what to do, but actually a company walking us alongside communities where that can give them the protection to carry out their own politics, right? Their own project. So really inspired, joined that, and kind of like you said, been involved in that ever since.
Could you remind me what year you went to FOR? Like when you went to Colombia for the first
Yeah,
time?
so I first learned about F1 in 2006, like the middle of the year at that event at the Resource Center for Nonviolence. And then I did a bunch of preparation. So I did my training in the US in 2007, and then I arrived there February of 2008. And literally the week that I arrived there, to situate this within Colombian history, the week
Mhm.
that I arrived was this week of these peace protests that were in support of the Alvaro Uribe right-wing government and their campaign against the FARC. So it was these large mobilizations across the country that were directed by the right wing against kind of an anti-kidnapping march against the FARC's kidnapping practice. So I came in, and like the first few days was these huge mobilizations from the right wing, and then also there were a lot of student protests in Bogota for student rights and the broader, peace and justice movement there. So came in my first week, just the country was, really, really active politically. It kind of always is, but it was a really intense week. And then I went to the peace community and accompanied there in the village of La Union and the other settlements there over the course of that next year. And a big part of that was the week after I got there was the return of the peace community to these villages of Mulatos and La Resbalosa, which at the time it was only 3 years removed from when the peace community's legal representative, Luis Eduardo Guerra, and seven other campesinos had been assassinated by paramilitary forces. So in 2008, I arrived, and a week after that, we were marching to Mulatos because the peace community is returning to those villages and resettling those. So that was my introduction to being there, and the peace community has continued every year to go back there, and I've participated in a bunch of those commemorations. So
Wow.
that was kind of when I got to Colombia and a little bit of the context in the country at the time. How about you? Do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of when you started going to Colombia,
Yeah,
what the context was like, and the work that you were doing as well?
sure. I mean, I've always gone to Colombia since I was a kid, but mostly to visit family. And it wasn't until I was in college that I started to go down and do more research or make connections with human rights organizations. It really picked up more when I moved to Colombia in 2009, shortly after those protests that you were talking about. I was also down in Colombia for those protests. Might be interesting to talk more about later. But yeah, I think living in Bogota back in 2009 was something that really shaped me in terms of how I got to see a very different side of what I had known to be a Colombian reality, right? By establishing more connections and working with, at that point, I was working with Corporación Nuevo Arcoíris, which was kind of a think tank that was responsible for, in large part, for breaking the parapolitics scandal, which led to over one-third of the Colombian Congress being investigated for ties to right-wing paramilitary groups. And I was also working with Asociación Minga in some of their work in Putumayo against the aerial fumigations, which were supported by the United States government to eliminate supposedly coca crops, but had tremendous humanitarian consequences for the people living down there. And so, being down there and being in these circles and seeing how serious things were and really learning a lot, just taking the time to listen to people changed my outlook, right? And I think grounded me in a way that was necessary to make my next move, which was to Washington, D.C. at WOLA, where I spent uh, close to 2.5, almost 3 years working at the Washington office on Latin America, where WOLA, which is a human rights organization that was founded in the late 70s by folks whose friends were disappeared by the Pinochet regime in Chile, has done a lot of work over the years on human rights in Latin America. And I was really fortunate to work with Jimena Sanchez, who I think remains a staunch advocate for rights in Colombia. And she has plenty of experience as well in the peace community. She worked with Peace Brigades International for a while. And so it was always kind of one of those emblematic cases that we were looking at, thinking about, talking about, educating people in Congress, in State Department, in USAID about when I was working in Washington. But that work in Washington really grinded me down. It was disheartening, and I ultimately kind of came to the conclusion that kind of human rights advocacy was not for me. Although I have a lot of respect for some of the people that are still holding up that fight. I needed to make changes when I did leave in 2012, and I was so inspired by the work of a lot of the folks in Urabá and in Tumaco and throughout the Pacific region of Colombia that I basically pulled together like a GoFundMe campaign to go down to Colombia and do kind of independent reporting on this recently passed victims and land restitution law in 2012. And so I founded this thing called the Colombia the Colombia Land Rights Monitor. And the first place I went to was the community councils of Curvarado and Higuamiandó, where the Comisión Intereclesial de Justicia y Paz was working. And I spent a lot of time between Curvarado and Apartadó and doing a lot of writing and working with folks, doing kind of, it seems in hindsight, like the accompaniment work that you and I have talked about over the years, although I wasn't directly affiliated with PBI, FOR, Witness for Peace, or one of these organizations. I was spending a lot of time in the humanitarian zone of Camelias, living with folks, and they were under constant paramilitary assault. For folks that don't know, the community councils of Curvarado and Higuamiandó were forcibly displaced in the late 1990s by right-wing paramilitary groups from their lands and forced to leave. And when they returned, in the early 2000s, what they found was African palm oil had just completely taken over and demolished the world that they had once known. Their communities had basically become African palm oil plantations. And thanks to these efforts to reclaim land through direct action, they were able to kind of return to where they were from and carve out a space for themselves within these plantations. And this obviously contributed to immense threats against the communities and even violence that endured to when I was living there, where the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia were still threatening and showing up in the communities armed and trying to intimidate people to leave. So despite being another one of these kinds of emblematic cases that has a whole legal jurisprudence to it and international support through the Organization of American States, Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and all of that, the people still live under immense threat. And what I was trying to do then was to document the kinds of threats that were coming up. And that really, that probably changed me more than anything, because it demonstrated what their perseverance, the dignity of their struggle could mean for just changing the conversation and their own lived experiences, right? Their entire lives changed when they went back, and I continue to draw a lot of inspiration from what it was those folks were doing. I also had the, incredible opportunity while I was living in Urabá to visit the peace community on a couple of occasions and learn from what folks are doing there. I'm just really appreciative for that stuff, those experiences, because they changed my outlook on life and politics in really profound ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of what you're talking about, obviously that Curvarado and like those communities, a separate part, different from San Jose, but in the same Urabá region, right? That's like this, northwestern Colombia, bordering Panama, and right near the Darien Gap, right, which is that really key corridor for drugs and arms trafficking, and now has become kind of a route for migration, which it really wasn't at the times, we were talking about, but has since, with the intensified precarity and dispossession that's occurring across the world, migrants kind of seeking to get into North America through that. And in the peace community's historical memory, that era of 96, 97, 98, they were displaced as well. And then by 98, when the kind of displacement were kind of spreading across the region, they were trying to return to their first villages. And the lessons from the oil palm going in that other part of Urabá was a lesson for the peace community, what was really behind the attacks against them. Now they kind of were able to resist and block those kind of extractivist projects, whether it was the agribusiness in the case there, or coal reserves that are in San Jose, and there's a concession to those to I believe a Korean mining company. So these kind of the communities being aware of what the others were going through was central also to them strengthening their own resistances, right? Kind of like learning from the other communities. And I remember, you mentioned the Alto Defensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, the AGC, and in 2008 when they announced themselves as a political actor with that new name, in the wake of the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, the AUC, which was kind of the umbrella paramilitary organization that was formally demobilized by the Alvaro Uribe government, but really it actually legalized these paramilitaries' holdings on wealth and land, even if formally the organization was disbanded, but then it just split into a lot of these different groups, Clan del Golfo, Águilas Negras, going by different names. And the AGC in 2008, I remember we were on a retreat as FOR. We had our team in Urabá, we had the team in Bogota, and then we had coordinators based out of San Francisco, and we had a retreat with all of us in Medellin at the time. And the armed strike, the AGC announcing its presence in the region, kind of take over, and it shut down public transport. And we went right back, like we had to cut our retreat short, and we went back to be in the peace community, and accompany them there. So my experience a little bit was, I was embedded in an organization and I stayed in FOR. I was in a company there 2008. I went back again in 2010. After I started grad school, I continued to be part of the organization. And as I did my research, I would be embedded with the FOR team. And I was on the board of directors when the Colombia Project became a new NGO called FOR Peace Presence. So I was always embedded in those teams. And so I had the benefit of always doing collective analysis with other solidarity activists, right? And we had to make decisions collectively around where do we move? Is it safe? Dialoguing collectively with the community leaders. And so I always had the backing of an organization that was providing this important solidarity work with the peace community and other communities in Colombia, where it's that presence increases their security and the diplomatic networks and all of that stuff. But you had a very different dynamic, of kind of being more independently and in a way being more embedded in the communities themselves, where accompaniment organizations like FOR, PBI kind of maintain a distance, at least institutionally, in order to kind of maintain institutional autonomy and try to not, get internally involved in the internal decisions of those organizations, right? So we had protocols about how we could communicate and make decisions, and kind of when we would make decisions together, but when we wouldn't, when we would make them separately. Do you want to talk about kind of doing this work independently, but very embedded in the organizations that you were doing? What did that feel like, and what was that like in all of this documentation work that you did, and how that led into you becoming an academic later?
This is a really great question. It's different everywhere that I've worked, right? So I guess when I was doing this project for the Colombia Land Rights Monitor, I worked primarily with two Colombian organizations, or organizations in Colombia. One was the Comisión Intereclesial de Justicia y Paz, or Justicia y Paz, and the other was the Proceso de Comunidades Negras, or the Black Community Process, PCN. And The way that I ended up arriving in these places was through very frank and honest dialogues with both PCN and with Justicia y Paz about what kind of work would be helpful for the kinds of goals that they had and what it would mean to have basically a gringo in these spaces and potentially writing about what was happening because so much of what happens is very difficult to document or not necessarily to document but to publish because of the security concerns related to what's happening. And so I would say like first and foremost it's like this disposition to building trust and dialogue over a long period of time. Like my relationships didn't just come out of this project, right? They were based in the time that I had spent working at WOLA very closely with these folks. So when they would come to the US, they would like stay at my house or like, maybe not, but we'd hang out a ton while they were around town. Or when we would go to Colombia, to document what was going on, they would be showing us around. So they were pre-existing relationships where we had built a lot of trust. And I think another kind of important aspect, at least for thinking about what was going on in Curvarado and Higuamiandó, is that Justicia y Paz is also an outside organization there, right? The people themselves, the humanitarians and the community itself is not necessarily part of Justicia y Paz. So there's like layers to the accompaniment that sometimes we don't always think about because Justicia y Paz was accompanying the people in Camelias, and I was staying with those folks. Now, PBI was also accompanying Justicia y Paz because the members of Justicia y Paz were so threatened by right-wing paramilitary groups primarily, but also by the FARC and the Colombian government at that point. And so, my relationship was basically like it was almost as if I was working with Justicia y Paz. Like there were, I think, two or three other young folks that were also living in Camelias full time at that point, doing work with Justicia y Paz, but they were not of the community, right? And they were the ones that were being accompanied by the non-Colombians. And so for me, I think another maybe interesting aspect of this is that oftentimes in community meetings or in meetings with government officials or things like that, a lot of the outside accompaniers would have to leave the room for political discussions to maintain kind of a sense of neutrality of what was going on. And that was not the case for me. And so I was able to, you know, be a part of conversations that I think were really interesting and important in shaping like how I understood the political conjuncture in Colombia at that point and like how people were making decisions about the kinds of activism that they were doing. And I think for good reason, a lot of the international accompaniers make that kind of decision from the outset. And it's not that I was like privy to every conversation. I don't have that kind of like insider status either, you know. But it did allow for me to be in certain spaces. And I think the other kind of difference was that like what I ended up writing sounded a lot more like independent journalism rather than the kinds of human rights reports that we might be more accustomed to getting from these places. I was trying to give an insight into the place and a feel for the place that doesn't always make it into those kinds of reports that are so important for documenting the kinds of violations that might be occurring. Uh, so I don't know if that kind of helps think through it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I'd love to ask a follow-up to that because when you make an important point about, when we think about outsiders, insiders, or these coalitions or these solidarity relationships, there's all these power relations involved, right? And the accompaniment organizations take a particular approach to that. Different organizations have different protocols on this, but being aware of those and trying to make decisions strategically around that. But the same dynamics occur, like we can think about this, U.S. versus Colombia, but the same kind of dynamics of relative levels of knowledge, or access to certain networks or privileges, being less under kind of the targets of violence. The same thing can happen someone from Bogota versus a Colombian campesino from the countryside, whether that's Cauca or Urabá. So some of these same dynamics play out as well there. I wondered, what are your lessons about trust building? Like thinking about other solidarity activists or academics too who are doing this work. Like you mentioned, like these are relationships built over many years. It takes a long time to develop these forms of trust, right? This isn't just you go in and you build trust really quickly. Do you want to say more about just building trust, the power relations at play there, and kind of your recommendations for people doing solidarity work or activist research?
I think it's really important to highlight the levels of violence, threats, and intimidation that exist and continue to exist in Colombia for folks that are part of social movements or struggles, and the ways in which missteps can really have devastating consequences for these struggles or organizations and communities, right? And so I think building trust is really, foundational to the kind of work we do. And, I've tried to be as ethical as possible in the ways in which I work with folks. And again, I've been very fortunate to have excellent mentors, people like Jimena, who had been working in Colombia for over a decade before I was there, basically introduced me to a lot of these folks. And she and I got to work very closely together for a while. Based on, I think, that kind of recommendation, I was able to at least meet people and have somebody vouch for me in a way. There's also a sense that you have to take responsibility, I think, for your own actions, right? And how you operate and live in a space. As far as like advice in terms of building trust, I mean, I never, at least consciously, tried to approach this in an opportunistic way. I tried to be very clear about what I wanted to do and what I could do, and not promising more than I could. And sometimes, like when we talk about these experiences in Curvarado, it was one moment where things really worked out in a way that like we had a good vibe, you know, things things worked well, and we were able to write some things. There was a report that came out of it, and it got circulated at the time, and I think that that was pretty amazing. But that's also kind of exceptional. It doesn't always work like that. I've been part of other initiatives where things have collapsed along these issues of trust. And especially when it's clear that I'm coming from the United States, there's all kinds of privileges that come with that are very clear to the folks that I'm working with. So like always the issue of money and compensation and what it is that you can offer and things like that, I think is really like important from the outset to kind of have clarity and be honest about. And sometimes that means that, a relationship might not work or flow. And that certainly happened for me as well. And the point there is not to push it if it doesn't. People have their reasons for doing what they do. I think another just aspect of this question of trust was when I started working more with PCN, which is the movement that have most closely worked with over the years. And the conversations were always extremely frank with them. And when they told me it was not safe enough to go somewhere, I listened. And there have been several times when I didn't know why. It seemed fine to me. I just didn't go somewhere, right? I think a lot of this is listening and knowing who to trust. And so much of that is just learned by spending time in places and not trying to like chase conflict or violence or something like that. So much of this work is actually pretty mundane, it can even be a drag of really long meetings in hot places, uncomfortable settings, and but getting to know people through these processes is beautiful, right? Becoming friends with them, like these folks that I work with, right? They're my compas, and that's been the most beautiful part of this is being part of a collective struggle.
Absolutely. I think there's this, dynamic of we come from different backgrounds or we're working for separate entities or organizations, but you through these relationships of trust and work, collective work over time, like you become, like you said, part of one community, like I'm never a peace community member because that's a certain set of commitments and an identity and a practice, right? Rooted in being campesinos, in a resistance organization. But, you build these really beautiful relationships. You make a really good point. Like I came in through FOR and there's an institutional relationship there. There's some trust that's built. You were introduced by Jimena Vuola. But then it's still on the individual person to build upon that and kind of deliver on the trust that's been built before. And so you need some sort of a connection, usually an introduction, but then spending time, I think is really important. And yeah, showing that you're in it for the struggle, and that we play different roles in that. So I wanted to come a little bit just to this topic of how we share the insights, right? So we've both gone on to become academics, and what I would say, at least in my framing, is the way the peace community talks about the importance of people documenting their stories is a contribution to the justice of history. In that, in a case of impunity, where through state systems of justice, there isn't real justice, reparations, the dignity of the land, a recognition of the violence, right? But there is a justice of history through the social movement's historical memory, and other people can contribute to that by documenting that. And oftentimes we play a key role, whether especially back then when people didn't have cameras and we could take pictures because we had those, or write things. Anthony published his book Dissident Peace, Autonomous Struggles in the State in Colombia. So has gone on to just really really amazing work here. Do you want to just say a little bit about the your academic book and then the journalistic writing you were doing as kind of your ways of contributing to that justice of history?
Thanks. You're embarrassing me a little bit. I writing the book for me was a way of dealing with a lot of the open questions that we were facing in struggle. And it was also a responsibility that I felt to the folks, right, that had opened their doors to me for so long and really helped me think through things, right? One part of being involved in these movements is it's so hard to take out the time to write about what's happening. And so it's often frustrating because, like in so many parts of Colombia and around the world that things are happening, but it's really difficult unless you're in direct conversation with the people that are facing them to get decent information about what's happening. And so, I thought about that in relationship to like how what I had read about Colombia, the kinds of books that helped me along the way to kind of develop a framework for understanding the reality of Colombia, the theories, the experiences that went into these really impressive movements that continue to shape how I think. And I wanted to contribute to those conversations based on my experiences. So in the book, like I'm basically taking the questions that I felt were really thorny and unresolved, particularly while I was living in Colombia in 2016 and 2017, right as the peace accords were being signed and implemented in that first year. To think through it, to write about it, and to share these kinds of, which in hindsight are kind of like stories about a remarkable moment in Colombian history, that first year of the peace accords. But I think that has been very influential in the 10 years that have followed. And so, I hope folks that find it helpful. I hope people are provoked by it. I hope people disagree with it and can show like where there are ways to sharpen our thinking around these questions. And it came out of a lot of love for the folks that are profiled in the book. It's and a lot of pain, really, because it's been a tough road. I mean, I think part of being in this is seeing how much violence continues to undermine and devastate the world and the communities and the people that we become so close with. But yeah, Chris, I mean, I want to also hear from you on this, right? Like I loved reading your book. It was extremely helpful for me thinking about another place in Colombia from somebody with the commitments that you share with, and I was also when we started talking about doing this interview, I don't know, maybe a little while ago, a couple of years ago. Uh, I didn't even know you made music, so I was really pleased to learn that like not only are you this like incredible scholar and activist, but you're also a musician. Can you like share a little bit about why 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 that's an important outlet for you and how you got into that?
Yeah. I think back to like you're just saying the intensity of the violence and honoring that and this is a broader question of like emotions and kind of who we are as people and how we fit in and how we resist. And so I love music and have been, making music since I was in high school. And that's one of my outlets where I kind of express emotions, process emotions, and then give, my take on the world in different ways, right? And I have songs about love and I have songs about politics and different things of that sort. And so after I was in Colombia and in FOR in 2008, I came back and I was still embedded in FOR, and we were part of that solidarity human rights movement that was pressuring the U.S. to cut its military aid to Colombia and end that form of assistance to the Colombian military, et cetera, including the glyphosate sprayings that you mentioned earlier. And so I thought, how could I contribute to that? So as a musician, my outlet was to write a song. So I wrote a song in 2009 called Peace Communities as my way of having something tangible that I could maybe use at events and things of that sort to raise awareness about US policy in Colombia. And then, kept playing music here and there, but really I was on a 10-year hiatus. Grad school took over being a professor, really from 2013 all the way until 2024. So over an 11-year period, I really didn't play hardly any music at all. And I got to a point in my career where I wanted to get back into this and kind of share these songs that I had composed or recorded in the past. And then in 2025, February, I co-organized the delegation of former people in FOR to go back to the peace community on a delegation and accompany the 20-year anniversary of the massacre in Mulatos and in La Resbalosa. So as I was working on my music and I was formally producing peace communities, the first version was in English. I thought, I need a version in Spanish of this. Both of you and I in our academic work, we often translate our work from English to Spanish and vice versa, right? So that it's available in both languages and kind of can connect with the broad people. So I was applying the same thing to my music. So I composed a remix in Espanol of Peace Communities to then present in February 2025 as part of the commemorations there. So I kind of created that. And I would just love your take, having listened to the songs, like what's your, and like you said about your book, like what do you find useful or critiques or the messages are kind of overlap in some ways, but also the two versions of the song, one written in 2009 has a certain focus, and then the 2024, 2025 version, it has a different, as my thinking's evolved. So I'd love your take and just response of what you find in the songs and your thoughts on them.
Yeah, no, I mean I I love listening to them, and I guess for me the main question that I have is what the remixed version is quite different in the content from the original version. The Spanish version seems much more grounded in the peace communities of San José Apartado, whereas the first version is could be more understood as like a broader notion of peace community in Colombia. But what I guess what constitutes that difference in the two versions? Like why did you kind of rewrite it that way at that moment? I guess the anniversary probably played into it, but like was there anything else that was moving you to write it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first version mostly directed towards a US audience. This is our policy there, and this is what's happening, right? So the peace communities, I named the song that, are an actor there. But then when I said, well, I'm going to be part of the commemoration of this massacre 20 years later, I need to foreground the actual community that we're commemorating, you know?
Yeah.
Then as I kind of translated some of the lessons from the first one about US policy, I then brought in kind of a broader take on history, like framing these movements, not just US policy, but in a broader stroke of history. And obviously, my thinking about these things evolved so much through all of my academic work that I felt like, in some ways, the remix en español is almost it's a summary musically of my book,
Yeah.
in some ways. And I reference some of the lessons from there. So do you want to say more about kind of some of the ideas in there and what your take on them is?
No, I guess I would rather hear from you, like, do you think that it's reflective of also like political shift within you in these last 15, 20 years? Like, because I mean, you are kind of framing it within broader processes of colonialism, right? And um, forms of like racial capitalism. And I think that that's really important for thinking through, right? Because there is kind of I think the story that when we were coming into doing a lot of the solidarity work about how so much of it was focused on a particular US foreign policy thinking, but this seems to be a much broader uh, kind of critique of what's happening in the second version. But I don't know. Is am I reading too much into it, or like how are you, how has your thinking changed? Is this like reflective of a shift in your politics as well?
Yeah, I'd love to maybe I'll respond, but do you want to say more about the differences that you perceived? You just named some of the broad strokes, but like any lines or just oh
Let
yeah,
me pull it.
I see there's been a transition here. You named a little bit already, but I'd love to hear you talk about that and then I'll respond.
Sure. So for me, like the verse in the song in the Spanish version that says, "Son por dominio del territorio, millones de desplazados del campesinado. Sabemos lo que está pasando, un saqueo racializado. Hacer justicia se ha negado, pero de estas memorias se forman luchas comunitarias, las comunidades de paz, resistencias solidarias." I really was moved by your framing of how things are moving in that verse of the song. And it's not one that comes up in the same way um in the original version. I think the closest verse in the original would say, "And in the process of sweeping to control the country's economy, the Paris displaced millions from the peasantry and massacre the peace communities. No justice, just impunity, but we can still do something." It seems to me like in the remixed version, there's more of an emphasis on how memory is contributing to a collective struggle that is remains in formation. And I think that's really important, right? Because it keeps this tension of violence uh, and struggle, but also how these movements are dynamic, right? They are moving and responding to a changing political conjuncture while also responding to historical injustices that are very much enlivened by debates and the way people understand their own histories from within the community. And so, I really appreciated that aspect of the remixed version of the song. And I don't know if you wanted to maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the first version, it's kind of a superficial reading of foreign policy and paramilitarism in terms of, resources and resource extraction and these type of economic interests. And I think as I and that less is, but we can do something. And I do talk a little bit about memory in the first version and the community maintain memory, and so we can kind of harness that as we work together. But I think as I learned more about history, I think two things really are strong in the Spanish remix. One is kind of starting out with rooting in about San Jose and that there's a commemoration happening, kind of foregrounding the movements rather than the U.S. Policy and military and the paramilitaries, right? So starting out from the resistance movements and what the victims are commemorating, right, and that they continue to be present. So that's a shift. The other is framing this not just in terms of a scramble for resources, but these are broader histories, which you named earlier, of colonialism. And so I try to give a sense of from the colonial era into the Cold War struggles, and then this neoliberal era, and kind of how this violence has persisted across that, right? So these violence in Colombia or other places around the world are tied to that broader global process. It's not just kind of limited to one international relation between Colombia and the U.S. The other thing is, and you're right, is having written about these things and participated in these movements, not just for 1 year, but over many years, that really rooting in what the experience of the movements is and foregrounding that. So the concluding verse talks about like we deal with all kinds of things in these movements, and I mentioned kind of panic and turbulence and these kind of things. But when we work together, we can connect with what I call kind of a collective divine, el divino colectivo, that is something that kind of transcends any of the individuals or even kind of any individual organization. That I think is something that I've learned in that in the process of that resistance and the face of the violence, that alternative of we could call it peace, we could call it ecological dignity, autonomy, that's created in that, even as you're resisting really difficult circumstances. So I think that over the years of taking that really seriously, and your book does an amazing job talking about these forms of autonomy and how they're constantly in struggle with violence and that. But I think that's really what it comes out in the latter version because I'd experienced that being in these movements and a part of them for so much longer that it was more about the movements and thinking about what that experience is and does and comes from than just the paramilitaries in the U.S. Actors. So yeah, I appreciate those comments so much, and I think they're right on.
Yeah. No, I mean, I thank you for writing and putting this out into the world, you know. I think it's so important. And, over the years, I've given a lot of thought about like what it means to build solidarity between peoples and especially based here in the United States. And it's extremely challenging, incredibly contradictory. And I'm just like grateful to be able to be in conversation with you and work through like so many of these hard questions because, these are crucial resources. And like as you're saying, like these struggles are built by participating in them. If we want them to move in different directions, we have to make them move in different directions, right? With each other. And I really appreciate this work, Chris.
Yeah, appreciate your work, and I mean it's just awesome to have you and I were in a way kind of working in parallel with different communities, even though obviously we've met some of the same people when these communities have their inter-community gatherings, right? Whether that's, a Minga organized or it's, the Universidad Campesina de la Resistencia, the Peasant University of Resistance, like it's kind of spaces, I've come across people that you worked with in other communities, and obviously some of the peace community members as well. We're kind of operating in parallel, but both with that commitment to document these and build these relationships over time and publish about it academically, publish it through journalism or through music and kind of these ways of raising awareness. And also, I think just to sustain our own work too. Like for me, the art is a powerful way to contribute to the conversation, but also just keep me moving, to have that creative outlet and expressing things in ways that's really meaningful for me. And I know you're such a serious writer, and that we kind of need these forms of creativity to process our thoughts, and that keeps us kind of moving forward in solidarity and within the movements that we're in. So yeah, any final thoughts, Anthony, before we
I don't know if it's a final thought, it's more of an invitation. And that what I like about what you're doing right now too is it creates more entry points. Because I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about the difficulties of building trust, the challenges of this kind of work. But I think oftentimes for people that are being introduced to it, it feels so intimidating. And I think a lot of what you do and how you operate in these spaces invites people to come in. And I think that's super important. And I hope, if anything, that people can take from something like this is to come on in, like, you know, reach out. It requires a level of vulnerability that perhaps folks are unaccustomed to. But I really appreciate how you work, what you work on, and what you're doing here. So thank you, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone check out Dissident Peace, Anthony Dest's book. Came out 2025. Really amazing ideas about politics, the racial dimensions, community state relationships. Really brilliant work to keep our thinking about all these just really difficult questions, so that we can be strategic in our movements and our research, whatever it may be. So thank you, Anthony, for the time. Appreciate it, man. So good to catch up and share ideas and actually learn more about our history through this. So it's really cool.
Yeah, likewise. Un abrazo.
All right.